Under consideration, House Joint Resolution Number 1. Good gentleman from District 21.
Thank you, good Speaker. I would ask unanimous consent to dispense with further reading of HJR 1.
You've heard the request. Is there objection? Hearing none, then the gentleman is recognized to open the debate on the joint resolution.
Thank you. I do hope you've had a chance to read through this. It's not long. This past summer, I think we all experienced a bit of angst. Lots going on. Our inability to react, that was frustrating. Frustrating to the point of we made attempts to bring ourselves here to no avail. We then began meeting as House and Senate working groups. I, for example, chaired a Senate and House State Affairs joint working group, and we discussed things about election law that ended up in the special session. We discussed things about appropriate authority, balance of power, and such, and those things did not end up in the special session. We came to the special session only able to discuss the things that were appointed to us. Again, very frustrating. The HDR you see here was a draft that I presented in our joint working group this summer. We wish that we had this authority this past summer. We wish the governor might have taken this up as a topic for a special session, but that didn't happen, and it wasn't our call. Once again, it wasn't our call. If I might, maybe with permission required, I want to read the statement of purpose, if that requires unanimous consent.
I believe the statement of purpose is fair game.
Thank you.
Without permission.
So now you may read along if you wish, that this joint resolution to the Idaho Constitution, this is the point, we want this to be a constitutional allowance that we have, just as it is for the governor. This is our role. This needs to be a constitutional allowance. To allow us to convene ourselves into an extraordinary session within 15 days of a written request of 60% of the members of the House and the Senate. It also conveniently describes some things to do with the organizational session that we want to make sure is constitutional. There is some cost. We met last summer. We had some costs that are incurred, and these are the actual costs on a daily basis of that session, if you want to compare what it might cost to call ourselves back in. A very reasonable price when you consider what our role is. I will stand for questions, but first I wish to turn some time over to my co-sponsor, Representative Mordaunt from District 14, with permission.
Is there further debate?
Mr. Speaker.
Good lady from District 14.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Speaker, this has been a long time in coming. Too long, in fact. I have been reminded by many constituents that we are nearing 300 days of waiting to be able to represent our people, our constituents. I want to take you back for a minute to the founding of our state constitution. On July 4th, actually, which seems fitting, in 1889, Governor Stevenson gathered 72 delegates, not far off from our number here in this very room, from disparate parts of the state that represented differing interests, differing cultures, topography, economics, politics. From around the state they came to pen our state constitution. From this diversity, we became from a territory, we moved to a unified state. Not only in our state constitution, of course, but in our precious United States Constitution. We guarantee the people a Republican form of government, and that happens through us as representatives of our constituents. It is essential to have this Republican form of government to restrict the expansion of government and ensure the preservation of our precious liberties. That balance between executive and legislative and judicial happens, and it's critical to happen to protect individual liberties. And we have felt that acutely over these last 300 days. It balances government overreach. This interrelationship between the Idaho legislature and the governor is designed to ensure limited government accountability, transparency, and fiscal responsibility as we execute our legislative duties. Now, under unanticipated, exigent circumstances, which we certainly could call these last 300 days, it may arise that the legislature needs to call itself into session, which is currently not possible, and that, of course, is what we are considering today. I do believe that it rises to the level of, first of all, being the first thing we consider here in this body. By no means will it solve all the problems that we and our constituents feel right now, but it will certainly, in the long term, restore that balance of power between the executive and the legislative body. It's times like these that it really is not perhaps there may be little incentive for the governor or the executive branch to choose to assemble the legislature for the purpose of being accountable to it. And that is exactly when we then need to be able to call ourselves, and this constitutional amendment addresses that. When we are calling ourselves into session, we ought to be extremely cognizant of the cost to the taxpayers. And you will see that this approach in our constitutional amendment does address that in part. When we call ourselves in to the tune of over $20,000 a day, we had better make sure that what we are calling ourselves into rises to the level of that expense to the taxpayer. So being cognizant of that, but also being committed to protecting the personal liberties and freedoms, the accountability and transparency with which our state conducts its business, I ask for your support of HJR 1. Thank you.
Is there further debate? Lady from 19.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I respect the good work that was put into this bill, and it's elegant in its simplicity. But I'm concerned that there aren't any sideboards in it. You know, normally when a governor calls us in to special session, it's for a stated purpose and it's limited to subject matter. And so my concern is that there are no limits to what subject matters we could address, no limits to how many days we could be in a special session, and how many special sessions we could have in a year. You know, when we get together, we have 1,000 ideas of things we want to do, and you know, the temptation is always there to run a bill, maybe because we want to make a statement rather than because it's is solving an urgent problem. And so I just worried about the lack of sideboards and the threat to our part-time citizen legislature that I think we all hold dear, with no limits and with only a 60% threshold of members who could have a number of priorities coming back to the State House. It's a slippery slope, and this could turn into something closer to a full-time job, which would be different than how our state has operated always. So for me, I will be a no on this, although I do respect the sentiment and the intent here. Thank you.
Is there further debate? Gentleman from 32.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the good gentleman from 21 stand for a question?
Will the good gentleman yield to a question?
The gentleman yields.
The gentleman yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is with the fiscal note, and I think it's somewhere around $21,300 per day. I'm not, the 13 years I've been here, I've always heard that figure to be somewhere around 33,000. I'm wondering where the discrepancy is.
The gentleman from 21.
Thank you. Yes, good speaker, gentlemen. Yes, that is the cost during the normal session. During the special session, though, there are fewer folks who are involved with us in a variety of capacities, and that's the difference of the cost. We've gone through the cost both in session and out of session, and there is a savings when we are in an extraordinary session that's different than when we are in a traditional session. So yes, we did examine those costs separately.
Gentleman from 32.
Mr. Speaker, would the gentleman yield to
Would
an
the
additional
gentleman yield to
question?
another question?
Gentleman yields.
The gentleman yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good gentleman. I think I recall reading in the newspaper that the security costs for the special session were significantly higher, I think $87,000 for the 3 days we were here, additional cost. Has that been factored into this, to this figure on the fiscal note?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the security costs have been considered as typical, not as they were in an extraordinary session. I think that was a special circumstance where more security was provided. There will always be different parameters in an extraordinary session. This, for example, does not include a weekend, right? Those costs would go up. This doesn't include the extra security forces that were required during that particular session. This is looking at the cost of a more typical extraordinary session.
32.
I thank the good gentleman for his answers and for the questions. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to debate the bill.
You have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen of the body, I firmly believe that the legislature needs to be able to call itself back into session. I think there's some parameters that need to be put on that. I think the 60% threshold is not the adequate number. The reason I believe that is if we go to the effort of calling ourselves back into session, most likely the gentleman on the second floor isn't going to like us being here, and any action we take will most likely be vetoed, and we will need a 2/3 majority to override that veto. So why we don't have a 2/3 majority to start with, to me, seems to be a significant issue. Now, in some of the whiteboards discussions that have been held on this piece of legislation, I heard that 60% was the right number. That's 42 of us. And after we got here, we could convince the other 5 people necessary, the 47 people necessary to override the veto, we could convince them. Well, if we're going to go to the expense of bringing $20,000 a day to call ourselves into section, plus the travel expense and all that's included, I just think we should be starting with the 2/3 majority. It's the same majority required to pass bonds. For me, that's a significant problem and a tripping point. And I know I've seen the co-sponsor list. This piece of legislation is going to pass, folks. That's not the point. But I literally can't support the 60%. I wish you would think about that today, and I know my flowery debate's not going to change anybody's mind. But to me, it's an issue. When we come here and arrive at a piece of legislation that is not perfect, our job is to stand up as 70 individuals, put it in the blender, and try to make it better. That's why I stand before you today. And like I say, I'm sure this piece of legislation is going to pass. But I'll be a no vote on this. I certainly support the concept, and I support and appreciate all the work that's gone into this piece of legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, good gentleman. Is there further debate? Good lady from District 33.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, friends. Just a couple points, because I fully support this. And remember that we are the representatives of the people, and it is our duty and our obligation to make sure that they are represented. And at times such as this, let me just remind you something that I think is so easily forgotten through the course of narrative that says we need to restore our co-equal branches of government. But let me remind you that we are not, and we're not meant to be, co-equal branches of government. How easily that is forgotten. The main branch of government is actually the legislative body. Why? Because we have so many more people that need to answer and work together in order to accomplish something. In this case, we have 105 legislators that need to work together. It is the legislative branch and then the executive branch, and the branch that is supposed to have the least amount of power, certainly not co-equal, would be the judicial branch. And so I remind us of our obligation when it comes to the people. And I also believe that this should not be, and for me, it certainly is not about our governor. Our governor was acting within the realm that he maybe thought he should. And so what we need to do, and what my colleagues on the other side need to also consider, is that put in another name. What if maybe we had South Dakota's governor? Maybe you wouldn't like that, and you would want to be able to have a means by which you could call yourself into session to address that. What if we, on our Republican side, say had the Michigan governor? We certainly probably wouldn't like that and would want a means by which we could call ourselves into session to address these problems. So let us think about the responsibility that we have as the legislative branch and move forward boldly and with courage to take care of this situation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, good lady. Is there further debate? Lady from District 18.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to very briefly respond, I fully support our ability to pull ourselves back into session, and I think we should be a full co-equal branch of government, and I think there are many circumstances in which it would make sense for us to pull ourselves back into session. So not disputing the core premise of what we're trying to do here. My one concern just is about it getting out of hand and the lack of sideboards, as has been discussed earlier, because I could see a scenario where, we may easily get 60% of people who want to come in, but they may all want to come in for something totally different. I may think, fantastic, we can get back into session. Maybe we can pass some criminal justice reform. And my good friend across the aisle may think, fantastic, let's get in. Maybe we can pass a tax cut. And somebody else may say, oh, what a great opportunity to pass a water bill. And someone else may think, oh, I can't wait to get in there so we can finally legalize hemp. And I could see us in a situation where we have 60 people signing on with 60 different pieces of legislation that they're all eager to get in and discuss. And then we get back to the potential for a year-round legislature problem. So I fully support our ability to call ourselves back in. I would just love to see something that requires a degree of focus so that we all kind of are in general agreement as to what the big problem is that we want to be coming back in to address, so we can be focused and time constrained and know what we're all coming back in for. So I guess that's my concern, but I do support the overarching principle of having the legislature call itself back in.
Is there further debate? A gentleman from 24.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. I want to make a comment here about this bill. I support it. I understand the 60%, the two-thirds question. There's going to be times when you have an issue that's very important that you would like to have a call in for session. But if someone presents to me a request to sign a form to call us back into session, and I don't know why we're going back into session, for what purpose, I'm never going to sign that. I have to know personally why we're being called back in session. And so I think that actual process of getting signatures gathered for this purpose will assure that we know why we're being called back into session. That, to me, I feel comfortable with that. This past year, education, which encompasses 50% of our general fund budget, we could not get that on the agenda for the extraordinary session. And there are many issues in there that were totally decided by the executive department. And as you will see in the coming weeks, there's going to be a lot of those decisions that are going to be confronted by the legislature themselves. Such an important part of our budget, we could not get that on the list of things, and I think we absolutely have to have the power to get back called in session. If we use 60%, and the argument that we can't override a veto with 60%, That may be true, but it will force the governor to find out why he wants to disagree so strongly with a legislature that would advance in a special session legislation. For that purpose alone, I think it's a good resolution. We should pass it.
Is there further debate? Lady from 9.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I fully agree that we should be able to call ourselves back into session when there's extraordinary circumstances that cannot wait until January. However, I believe this vehicle is much too wordy. I hope that all of you have availed yourself to go to the Secretary of State's office and get copies of this book. It has both the U.S. Constitution and the Idaho Constitution and the Declaration of Independence in it with all the amendments. So as I learned the Constitution from the time I was very young, that constitutions are a framework with limited words, and you fill them in with law. So this amendment we have before us, to me, reads much of it like a law. Many of us have talked among ourselves to have something very simple, very easy, that simply says the legislature may convene for organizational session or at other times when they deem necessary as prescribed by law. Then we can come in and debate about the different sideboards to put on there. Now, I know my constituents certainly would hold me accountable if I agreed to come in for every frivolous thing that came along that could not wait. They are our checkpoint to be sure we don't become full-time legislators. For example, in the book that I just lifted up, the U.S. Constitution has a total of 5 pages, not counting the amendments. Our Idaho Constitution has a total of 33 pages, not counting the amendments. And when you look through there are many, many parts of it that should really be in law. You know how difficult it is to change the Constitution. It has to be during the general election. So for us to try to get some of those extra words out, it's very difficult. So for me, the principle of this amendment should be very easy to read, where we fill in with law and have that debate then, as we could every single year. And when we take this, whatever we end up with, before the entire citizens who has to also vote on this, the fewer words we have, the easier it is for us to explain why we need to do this. So for this reason, I reluctantly am going to have to vote no on this. Thank you.
Is there further debate? Lady from, all right, somebody's got to stand up here. Gentleman from 27.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Debate against the bill.
Yeah,
We've operated for 130 years as a state with not being able to call ourselves back. And I don't think we've been hurt by that. Also, when the founding fathers of the state decided that they would allow the governor to call us back in a special session, he was limited to only be able to call us back for a single subject. So I have to vote against this because I think my good gentleman to my right is exactly right when it comes to the 2/3 majority. If we don't have a bar set as high as our citizens have to go to pass a school bond to build a new school, if we're going to operate on less than that, then I think that's wrong. And I don't think that we should be able to call ourselves back and then when we get here decide that we can introduce any piece of legislation that we want. I think that's the quickest way there is to a full-time legislature. And I certainly want to keep a part-time citizens legislature that comes here, understands that they have 70 or 80 days to conduct their business, and they need to get that business done so that they can go home and live under the same rules and regulations that we pass here, the same as the rest of the citizens do, make a living under those regulations, the same that the rest of the citizens do, and leave the citizens alone for the remainder of the year. I don't know which one of our founding federal fathers said that the greatest peril to the citizenry is when the Congress is in session. But I don't want that to become the same here in Idaho. We need to come here for 70 days, 80 days, finish our business, and go home. I suppose I could envision a scenario under which we need to call ourselves back, but it should be extremely, extremely difficult to do so. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'll be voting no. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there further debate? Jump from 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As long as we're talking about percentages, I want to remind the body that it only takes 1/3 of the body to issue a call to the House. And if we're going to address issues like leaving the citizens alone, maybe we should also think about how the administration is failing to do that by allowing the regional districts and the local districts to impose restrictions on a virus. If we were looking at 1918 when there were bodies piled up, people were dying in the streets, that'd be one thing. But when we're talking about testing positive for a virus, I'm not so sure that we can say that the representatives of the people should not be trying to act as some kind of an insulator against what we're seeing come from the administrative branch. Thank you.
Thank you, good gentleman. Is there further debate? Gentleman from 32.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe this is an effort to talk about school bonds, and I wanted to address that real quick. I believe that's an issue that with the government prerogative, you know, we're talking about the government desires and wants to pass a school bond. This is the people's prerogative. They want us here to address an issue, then let's be here and do that. And I want to reiterate one issue, another principle that was brought up. The three branches of government should not be equal. Our founders designed it to be that this branch is the most powerful for an obvious reason. The people's desires and wants and needs, plain and simple. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there further debate? Gentleman from 30.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've thought a lot about this particular issue, and I have to admit I've been a little conflicted. But let me just explain to you my thoughts and my reasoning. I'm a proponent of constitutional principles, and one of the grand constitutional principles of our federal system and of virtually all of our state systems is that we have checks and balances. One of those honored checks and balances at the national level has always been recognized that the President calls special sessions of Congress. At the national level, that's become a moot issue because Congress meets year-round now. And most of us would hope that Congress didn't meet year-round. So I've thought about that particular principle in relationship to our state. And I think times have changed a bit. And the possibility for situations that would necessitate us coming back have multiplied, and I think will multiply. The legislature should control the purse strings. That, too, is an honored constitutional principle. And we can't control the purse strings if we're not here. So I've arrived at this conclusion. I feel comfortable with this amendment. I think that we do need, under these extraordinary circumstances we've come to in this country, we do need the privilege of calling ourselves back in to session so that we might honor other constitutional principles of making law, making sure that law is followed, and exercising the right of the purse string, appropriating money, especially when that money is a lot. So I'm comfortable with this. I feel it's the right thing for us to do now in the state of Idaho, and I will vote in favor.
Gentleman from 35. The new desk is a lot like the old desk.
It's my first time. Would the good gentleman from 21 yield to a question?
Will the good gentleman yield?
Gentleman yields.
The gentleman yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good gentleman. When we come back into this session, unlike when we come to a regular session, our expenses out of that $21,000, are they just reimbursed as expenses, or do we get a per diem?
Gentleman from 21.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and gentleman from 35. They are as they were this summer, which are reimbursements. There's no per diem and no increase in salary.
Gentleman from 35.
To debate the bill, Mr. Speaker.
At the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be voting in favor of this bill, and I think it's important that the people understand how we get paid. We get paid north of $18,000 a year. When we come back into, and for many of us, that's a lot of money, but for many of us, we take a pay cut when we come to the legislature, and we don't get paid overtime to come back to special sessions. We don't get paid extra money, and we don't get paid a per diem, which is sometimes we have expenses less than the per diem, and we can use that money to help our constituents. But in this case, we only get reimbursed for our actual expenses when we come back into session. Therefore, we're not incented financially to come back into session. And to me, that's a check and balance in itself, to come with a purpose, to come with an idea that we're only going to be here a short time, hopefully, and that we get the people's business done. And so with that, I'll be voting in favor of this, and hopefully we can take care of problems that needed taken care of this year and from now on. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Is there further debate? Gentleman from District 31.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to voice my support of this legislation and indicate that, to me, for 10 months now, the executive branch has been exercising.
Good gentleman. Yeah. We
Thank you. For 10
we want to
months
record
now,
this for history.
Thank you.
Your first debate on the House floor.
Very well. I'd like to indicate that for 10 months now, to me, the executive branch has been exercising its own authority as well as the legislative authority that we hold in this body. Furthermore, it takes some time for the judicial branch to exercise its check. And one could argue that for 10 months, the executive branch has, in essence, held all of the power in the state. I feel like the checks and balances in our system of government require us to pass this legislation, and I'll be voting in favor of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Good lady from District 10.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to speak in favor of this, and the reason being that many of my constituents have asked for exactly this to happen. And if it was just us deciding, then I would have pause, but it goes in front of all of the people of Idaho to make that determination, so I will be voting in favor. Thank you.
Is there further debate? Oh, good lady from District 31.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a couple things here. Ladies and gentlemen, as we talk about this issue, I think it's important that we don't conflate the decision to meet with the decision to support a certain issue. They're two entirely separate questions. The 60% simply means that there's something happening that we all feel strongly about, whatever it is, that we are willing to leave behind our jobs, our families, all of the activities that are going on back home, and come here with our suitcase and spend long days trying to solve problems. And not only are we not financially incentivized to do this, but we sacrifice a lot to come. 60% means that many people are willing to sacrifice enough to be here. Now, once we get here, will 66% of us agree on a particular solution? Maybe, and maybe not. But if 60% of us are convinced that it's important enough to sacrifice to be here, I believe we should have that opportunity. Now, one other thing that I think is important to consider. Under these circumstances, the choice that we have to make is, do we have a way moving forward to call ourselves into session, or do we not? That's the choice that we have right now at this point in time. We support a solution that allows us to call ourselves into session, or we say no and we leave ourselves without a solution. So it may not be a perfect solution, but I believe that it's an important solution and it's a way forward. And for that reason, I will be voting yes.
Is there further debate? Gentleman from 22.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hesitated to debate on this bill, but I thought, been working on this since last summer and in working groups and up until we got here, and I thought, well, maybe I'd at least share a few of my thoughts with you anyway. One of the complaints is that this can lead to us being a full-time legislature. Maybe I'd like to remind us that nothing prevents us right now from remaining here all year long. Nothing. If we decide not to sine die, we can sit here all year long. Now, none of us want to do that. We've never wanted to do that, and I don't think we ever will want to do that, at least with the people that I know here in this body. So I don't see how us being able to call ourselves back in changes that ability. Next point that I hear about is the 60%. Why 60%? Why not 66? A school bond or levy requires 66, or it requires 66% to override a veto. We're talking about the ability for us to talk to each other, just to talk. We want to get together to talk about something. And that's a pretty high bar already. 60% of us have got to want to come in and talk about that. Not pass something, just to talk. 60%. I think that's a fair number. I'd like it a little lower, to be honest with you, but I'll be okay with 60. During the special session that we had in August, we had a bill that came up that the gentleman on the second floor did not propose, was not one of the listed bills that he wanted with our liability bill. And we passed that. And he didn't veto it. We didn't need 66.6% to pass a piece of legislation in the special session that was even different from what the gentleman on the second floor required or asked us to do. So why would we make it this high bar just to talk when all we have to have is something that's 50% to pass if it's a good idea? And if it's a good idea, I think the gentleman on the second floor will sign it and pass it if it's a good idea. So I don't necessarily need that high bar just to get us to talk. Also remind us that the majority of the states have this ability. It's interesting, when you look at state constitutions, the ones that are all put together at similar time frames, they mimic each other. The time frame in which ours was put together, they all kind of mimic each other, and this was something that was just kind of unique at that time. But the majority of states have this ability. I think it's appropriate, and I think we should have that as well. And the final thing I would bring up is this is not decided by us here. What we're voting on right now is whether or not the people get to decide if this is a good idea. We're not deciding whether or not we can call ourselves back in. We're proposing the idea. Here's the idea. Idahoans, you tell us if this is a good idea. That's all we're doing today. And for that, and no other reason, I would recommend that you support this legislation.
Is there further debate? Gentleman from District 7.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to rise in favor of this bill.
You have the floor.
So, for the majority of my life, I was under the illusion that we had 3 equal branches of government here in Idaho. It wasn't until this pandemic came along that I was educated on what's really going on here. In my simple logic, for those that you know me, it's very simple. If we could not meet without the permission of the executive branch, how does that make us equal with the executive branch? Essentially, the House is held hostage in times of crisis by the executive branch. All we are asking with this bill, under my understanding, is that in extraordinary circumstances, we can have the ability, because we are the people's house, to come and do the people's business. We are not asking for more authority than the executive branch or the judicial branch. We are just asking for equal opportunity to solve the crisis. As for the concern of being called back in and being a full-time legislature, I'm new here, and I don't know a lot, but I can almost guarantee you that this body is responsible enough that they will not do something that is not absolutely needed. I have 100% faith in this body doing the right thing. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, good gentleman. Is there further debate? Gentleman from 6.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to speak in favor of this resolution. The amount of calls, letters, and emails I've received from constituents since I've been in office over this pandemic, many of them have been very sad. From some people that have been extremely desperate, just trying to make ends meet, feed their family, keep their business open. And I think the executive overreach that has happened is a travesty. And for me to have to tell people, oh, well, when they ask, well, what can you do for us, Aaron? And I have to say, oh, well, there's nothing really we can do. The governor's either got to call us in or we have to wait till January. And that is not an answer at all. To me, it's having to shirk my duty. And so for that reason, when the people need us in here, we need to be able to come in here and get the job done. We were meant to be the first branch of government, and that's exactly what we should be. So I will be voting yes on this. Thank you.
Thank you, good gentleman. Is there further debate? Gentleman from 13.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Debate in favor of the resolution.
You have the floor.
I'd like to remind the body, take you back to, say, April or May of 2020. If this option would have been available and it would have taken 60% of us to get ourselves back in here, could we have acquired the 60%? Yeah, we could have. Could the Senate have acquired 60% of its members to get itself here? Yes, we could have. For more than 90 days, we pleaded with the governor to get ourselves into a special session so we could have our voice heard. However, given the current constraints that are placed upon us, the gentleman on the second floor was able to put the parameters around what that special session would look like and what we would want to talk about. So I've heard today arguments that we need to make sure that possibly in the future we only talk about a single subject. I think that's short-sighted. In the 2 weeks that we've been here trying to figure out a way forward to get life back to normal for our citizens,
I told my wife the other night, every single day another issue pops up that is related to the pandemic. Okay, how are you going to handle that issue? What are you going to do with this issue? So tying our hands that we could only deal with a single subject in an extraordinary session, I think is short-sighted and foolish. The idea that we should have 66 2/3, the Senate proposed that. The bill's sponsor actually wanted 50%. I agreed with the bill's sponsor. I wanted 50%. The Senate said we want 66 2/3. We ended up at 60%. That's what we do in this body. We negotiate. We compromise. We make decisions that will work for both bodies. I would remind the body that it only takes a concurrent resolution, only takes 50% to pass in order to end an emergency. So we don't have to have 66 2/3 votes inside of an organizational session to undo an emergency. We only need 50%, because the way you stop an emergency is through a concurrent resolution, not through law. And finally, we made a promise to our constituents. We told them, by George, if you will get us in a special session, or I'll tell you what, when I get there in January, I'm going to make sure that we rein in the overreach by the executive branch, we rein in the health districts, we have the ability to call ourselves back into special session. And that's exactly what this resolution does. So, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to have to go home to my constituents and say, well, you know what, I know you guys were frustrated as we were that we couldn't call ourselves back into session, but, you know, it was too wordy. So I couldn't support it because it was too wordy. Or I couldn't support it because it required 66 2/3. Or I couldn't support it because it didn't do this or it didn't do that. You know what it does do? It gives this body the ability to call itself back into special session, to have the conversation that needs to be had for our constituents. And so with that, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that this body honor our word that we made to our constituents and send a very clear message to our constituents on the first piece of legislation that comes forward. We're here to honor our word, we're here to pass this legislation, and we're in business to make sure that we get this place back to normal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Is there further debate? Gentleman from 14.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members of the House, to debate the bill.
You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to make a couple of quick comments, because I just want to make a couple of comments. The first thing I want to say is, you know, I didn't get elected to come down here and sit around and let the governor be king. Think about what I'm saying. You saw
Sometimes we refer to him
the good gentleman on the second floor.
Yeah.
The good gentleman on the second floor.
Particularly during debate on the House floor, it's the gentleman on the second floor or something more.
Well, I appreciate the good gentleman on the second floor and what he's doing and trying to do. I think that he should have involved us in the legislature. Think about what you've heard when you've been home. Think about what's going on right now in Idaho. As you go home this weekend, you're going to see some things that will frustrate you. It's control. Our founding fathers didn't set the system up so that the good gentleman on the second floor was in charge and king and everything. He's supposed to run everything when you're gone. And by the way, we're guilty for causing part of the problem, and let me explain why. How many of us have voted for bills that said, and the executive branch will bring rules? Rules are law. We gave away our authority. How many of us have voted for bills that say, hey, when we leave town, the governor can spend this money here or there? We're supposed to spend the money. You saw what happened this year, what, $1 billion, almost $1.5 billion. None of you got a vote on that. Neither did my people that I represent have a say at all on that. What are you thinking? And then I hear people say, well, we should just make the Constitution small and then we can fill it in with a law to make it more explain it better. Are you kidding me? Then you bring the governor back into the situation to tell you whether or not he accepts what you're trying to put in the law to make the Constitution work. One of the biggest mistakes we ever do is do that. We do it in bills with rules. We do it in the Constitution where we say by legislative, authority or some legislative action. You got to stop, guys. We need to take back the authority that was given to us by the founding fathers. We need to be the legislative branch. And if that means we have to come back in once or twice a year to fix some problems, so be it. That's what we got elected to do. This is a simple constitutional amendment, and I think the best debate today came from the good lady from 10. Let the people decide. All this does is sends it out so the people can vote on it. I think there's a whole lot of them that would love to have the opportunity to vote about us coming back into session, especially right now. So I apologize for being a little gruff. I'm kind of a little doopy today, but I hope that you'll support this. This is the right thing to do. You're not making the decision, by the way. The voters will when they go to the ballot box. Thank you.
Thank you, good gentleman. Is there further debate? Hearing none, will the gentleman from District 21 please stand and close the debate? And did you guys split the opening?
We did.
Will you split the closing?
If we need to.
Well, it's your call. I just needed to know.
We
we'll let her decide.
We
you have the floor to close the debate.
Thank you. I made lots of notes, and thank you, good gentlemen and good women, for answering providing my closing remarks. You know, it is interesting that we are only one of 14 states who can't do this. Is that insane? Surprising. It's almost laughable, the thought that we might somehow turn into a full-time legislature on this constitutional amendment. You know, March 26th rolls around this year, and some reason, I'm hoping to stay a little longer, but you folks can't wait to get out of here. And so we close things down and we shut things down and we go home. We'll talk about water and hemp and judicial issues and reforms during the session. We know that. But if we can find 60% who have something they want to talk about, it's time for us to come in. And you're right, it's not a perfect bill because I'd asked for 50%. And as one good gentleman mentioned, that's what it takes for resolutions. We don't need 60% for that. So even with 60%, we can't quite do the business that perhaps we want to do. But just the same, I do appreciate the support we've heard, the good comments, and I would ask for your green light.
To finish
Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, have appreciated the thoughts. This, in my mind, that 60% is a sweet spot in determining if we have concern that rises to the level of causing our taxpayers to reach into their pockets and fork over a little more so that we can address things of immediate concern. This is a question of our representative governance and that principle and our commitment to that principle. This constitutional amendment is clear. It is simple and it is powerful in allowing the people to always have a voice in our state. So I would encourage you to give the people their voice, give them the option to vote on this, and vote yes with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Debate is closed. Have all the pairs made it to the clerk? All right. Thank you. Debate is closed. The question before us is, shall House Joint Resolution Number 1 pass the House? This resolution requires 47 votes, or 2/3 of the body, for passage. The clerk will unlock the machine and the members will cast their votes. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change his vote? The clerk will lock the machine and record the vote. And read the pairs.
Cheney votes aye. Kingsley votes aye. Likely votes nay. Palmer votes aye. Blanksma votes aye. Toon votes nay.
The vote count shows 51 in favor with 18 against and 1 absent. More than 47 having voted in the affirmative, the resolution has passed the House to be transmitted to the Senate.